What up, y'all? Let me see. Let me put something in the. All right, there she go. Neff, let me know how you. All right, do I invite you to join? How we do this? Let me see. Do I invite or do you request an invite? All right, there it is. Go to request. Y'all can hear. Peace, brother Travis. Put one in the chat if y'all can hear.
Blessings.
What up, though?
What's up in my eye? Can you hear me fine?
What's up in my eye?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I hear you good. Can you hear me? All right.
I'm feeling good. I'm glad. I'm
feeling?
excited to have this conversation. I think it's a very important one that we've been needing to have for a while. So
Yeah. Your energy looks great. It looks like you're taking in a lot of sun.
I'm getting plenty of sun, getting that vitamin D, that solar charge. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let me hold. I want to pin the question to the joint. So I'm gonna type it in before we start talking,
Okay.
just so I can pin it. So hold on. Let me
Sounds
pull
good.
this up. I'm getting a little
Welcome,
slight echo.
family,
I don't
to
know
those
why.
who are with us live.
All right, hold up. I'm pulling up the live right now on my laptop, so I can pin the topic to the joint.
Yeah, it's going to be a very powerful discussion. I think this is a conversation that we've really been needing to have candidly, and one that we really need to have holistically, like really from an African-centered perspective and not from a linear perspective, which I think is where this conversation is landed at this point. So.
Yeah. I think that in a lot of ways, this conversation oftentimes gets trapped among like the weeds of ignorance, and it doesn't allow it to progress and grow forward. So I think that what we can engage in today is an element of detangling, some of the nonsense that has grown side by side, with this conversation.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be a beautiful one.
And my intention is really to have a bird's eye view. Like I always like to, channel in and have Sankofa moments where we go back to what we've had ancestrally and bring that forward so that it can really anchor us into where we're moving. So when it comes to like the concept of Heru, or the energy, the principle of Heru, it really is, the Falcon's perspective is having that bird's eye view. It's really understanding what's going on and honoring all parts, right? Really having a whole perspective. And I think that despite like the ignorance, like the masses of people are ignorant of a lot, like just don't have a lot of information, and have, skewed information too. So it's also about the narrative. I think the narrative is very, very important. Like, who is controlling the narrative, and are we talking about the same thing? What is the point? Because you can be talking about the same topic and have two completely different narratives on what you're talking about. So I think it would be great for you to like set the stage in terms of like, what are we talking about?
Yeah, and there's going to be a lot of layers to that we unpack through the conversation. So just to give context and some continuity to the conversation. So this past Friday, I had a conversation with a really sincere brother. I think his name is Sincere Love to God, hip hop artist, but also a content creator, podcaster. So he joined the live with me. He invited me to actually have a live so we could have a conversation around the FBA identity. And, my contention was that essentially, linking your identity or linking our identity as African people in America to America is the equivalent of kind of linking your identity to a sinking ship. So, he pulled up for that conversation. But following that convo, he went and did like a live reaction video where I guess he watched our back and forth in real time. And one of the points that he raised was that essentially all of the living master teachers, right, is what he refers to them as. He said all the living master teachers are in alignment with FBA, and they support FBA. And two of the master teachers that he named specifically were Dr. James Small, or Professor James Small, and our good brother Kaba Kamini, right? So when I saw that, like, I reached out to you and was like, you know, we kind of like need to have a conversation about this in terms of like, you know, what is the role of the elders, especially with like the complexity of this digital age and the age of misinformation, because people are using, you know, proximity to the elders to give cover, you know, to ignorance and nonsense. So I wanted us, hold on, baby girl, don't come. Get me a donut. All right, do me a favor, go upstairs and ask mom. Mom's upstairs. All right. So, you know, a lot of people are using, you know, it's like if you're familiar with logical fallacies, right? There's a logical fallacy called appeal to authority. So it's like you'll drop a name and you'll say that because this person supports, right? And that word support really needs to be unpacked, but you'll say that because this person supports, then that necessarily means that the position that we have is one that is valid, or one, you know, that represents a measure of intelligence or sophistication. And in this case, that is not the case, right? So I say, you know, let's have this conversation to ask, you know, do our Pan-African elders have a responsibility to hold, you know, FBA accountable? And when I say accountable, I'm specifically talking about the systemic misrepresentation and misinformation campaign that has been led from the top of FBA all the way to the bottom when it comes to Pan-Africanism, right? The assaults on Pan-Africanism. But in addition to that, the assaults on African people and the confusion around our African identity. Do our Pan-African elders have the responsibility to confront and correct that if their proximity to some of these folks is being used as cover to say that what we are doing is correct or in right standing or being supported by the elders? So yeah, that's the convo I wanted to have.
I want to start first and foremost by saying that, like, really the issue of identity in itself is like the foundation of this conversation. And I think that there's a distinction that's being made as far as specifically speaking to foundational Black Americans, which I do think is a term, or, you know, that was first said by Dr. Leonard Jeffries, if I recall correctly, as a way of distinguishing Africans colonized in America who were part of building the foundation, literally, of capitalism, of the economy, and building and creating what we know as the divided states, right? Because also America is vast. I think that that's very important as well. Like, I'm in Central America right now. There's South America. America isn't inherently something that is, you know, necessarily like European, and for us to determine that particular landmass of what, you know, the natives would call Turtle Island, or, you know, there's just a lot of nuance to the conversation. And I feel like that's where, like, the question of validity really comes. No one can say, like, it's invalid to say that there are foundational Black Americans. I don't think that that's something that's not the argument, and that's not even, I personally don't even feel like there is an argument. I feel like there's like a distraction happening, because the distinction is between identity and politics, and they are linked, and everything is connected holistically. But we have separation and distinction for a reason. It serves a purpose, because there are different experiences within the Pan-African world. So I do think it's important to make distinctions amongst us, because we have different experiences So it's not invalid to specifically look at Africans who were colonized in America. And I think the other element that comes into it is the distancing that's actually happening from an unhealed place when it comes to people wanting to distance themselves with the identity of African. But if we're talking about Pan-African elders who consider themselves to be Pan-African, they identify as African foundationally. So the question of identity is not a question to those elders. And also in an African context, like holistically speaking, right? The aspect that connects our culture across borders and artificial lines and different traditions and ethnicities is rooted in our holistic perspective of looking at things as both and. And the European distinction is either or. You know, it's constantly objectifying and separating and dichotomizing. As a whole, African culture is full of soul, and it's about unity. It's carbon. It's literally magnetized. It brings things together. It synthesizes. So for us, I feel it's very important to also synthesize the idea of eldership. And it's not a linear thing in the way that Europeans look at what an elder is. You don't just age and now you're an elder. You know, like there is duty and there is responsibility. And to answer the question directly, I will say yes, Pan-African elders absolutely have a duty to not only critique all things, but to provide guidance. So
correct, yeah. Correct,
so so yes, absolutely yes, there is a duty there. My question is, who and how do we lift our elders to accountability? Because if that's a duty that they have, then that's one that they have to be accountable to. And I think that that's where the circle happens, where we're in this like linear perspective of what the elder is and like the elders at the top, and that's not how it works. It's a circle. The elder comes back around because the elder is leading. And I think we also have a responsibility and a duty to keep that accountability the same way. And I think it needs to be a reciprocal relationship.
Yeah, there has to be some level of like intergenerational dialogue. And I want to just state clearly, because I think we've already lifted up the names of the two elders who, when it comes to kind of like this FBA contingent, we're referring to Professor James Small and Baba Kaba Kamini. And the reason why I want to state that is because first and foremost, we do consider them to be elders, right? Because as you stated, you know, not every older is an elder, but when it comes to these two respected scholars, these two respected warriors, hands down, we consider them elders, right? So from my perspective, and there's a lot that I really want to unpack in this conversation. And, you know, hopefully we have the time to kind of like weave together the nuance, right? But my issue was this, and it's one of the things that I stated when I had the Brother Sincere on. Professor James Smalls and Brother Kaba Kamini are not necessarily close enough to ground zero of the misinformation and disinformation campaign that is FBA to understand why their embrace of it and support of it could be seen as problematic, right? For all intents and purposes, unless you, unless you were engaging during the periods of 2018 and 2019 on Twitter, you didn't really see the development of this formation and or this hashtag lineage movement and what it represented. So from its very inception, before FBA as a term was created, right? Because you mentioned Dr. Leonard Jeffries. I don't think that Dr. Leonard Jeffries came up with the term foundational Black American. Typically what folks do in that particular space is they say that the foundational Black American moniker is an extension to the moniker that, what's the elder's name, or the, what's his name? He wrote the book Black Labor, White Wealth. What's his name? He's Boyce Watkins always. I can't even think of his name right now. Paul Anderson. Yeah, yeah. So a lot of them like to say that the FBA moniker is an extension of a moniker that Claude Anderson created, which was Native Black American. But if you ever listen to Claude Anderson speaks, Claude Anderson has been engaging in self-negation, throughout, his career as a speaker, which is why I always say, like, I respect some of his economic observations, but when it comes to the cultural and the political, he's not someone that I would ever align with, or any Pan-Africanist would align with. He's not a Pan-Africanist. He's not a nationalist. In fact, he goes out of his way to say, hey, we don't have any connection to Africa. We are not an African people. Like, we are an American people. So, so the FBA people tend to use him as their, I guess, entry point to anchor kind of like that particular naming convention. But if you go back to 2018, 2019, when this whole hashtag lineage movement was given birth, right? And the reason why I call it a hashtag lineage movement, because it started with this development online of, Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore engaging this conversation around the wealth gap in America and what solutions would be to the wealth gap. And when they first started the conversation around the wealth gap back in 2014, 2015, they were actually against reparations at the time, right? But after the 2016 loss of Bernie Sanders, they kind of threw away the broad-based economic reforms, and they dialed in on reparations would be the only thing that would allow us to achieve parity in America, to achieve, economic equity in America. So once they got on this reparations conversation, that's when they started this need for a renaming, right, to get specific in terms of who we're speaking about. And Yvette Carnell was very clear. Her sentiments have always been anti-African, right, from the very beginning, right? She's always held these deeply anti-African sentiments. So she said we need to detach ourselves or our identity from Africa because we are not an African people, right? And ADOS was the forerunner that FBA comes out of, right? And once FBA kind of like did their little break off.
Can you express what that is for people who may not be familiar with what ADOS is?
ADOS was the first of the identities created by the hashtag lineage
and that's
movement.
African
hashtag
descendants
ADOS, which
of
stood
slaves.
for
what was that?
Not Africans.
Oh wow,
Americans
okay.
Descendants.
They went all the way to
right.
The
so
left.
the goal from the very beginning was to remove, any African connection from Black people in America. It's like, we ain't African. It's kind of like, it's a continuation of what I refer to as lost tribe identitarian movements. So essentially in America, we've always had these lost tribe movements where the basic foundational understanding is that we as Black people, as a result of the period of enslavement, had all of our Africanity erased, had all of our African culture erased, right? So we're a blank slate. And you see, folks then start to ascribe, whether it be Hebrew Israelite or Moor or, American Negro, it's looking for an identity that can essentially affix us, right, to this particular political project of Western Europeans, which is the United States of America. And in that search for an identity, a prerequisite has always been a negation culturally and politically of our African connection, right? So they've all, that particular strain of thought has always been anti-African, anti-Pan-African, anti-nationalism, right? But that's a history component that you have to even engage in an intelligent conversation around these particular naming conventions and what they mean, right? So the ADOS piece starts, and then out of that, you start to get different splinter groups, but they all have the same.
To me, it's like the church, right? Like you got the church, and then you have all these different sects of Christianity. Like, I'm Baptist, I'm Pentecostal, I'm like, it's really like the essence of it is divisive. And I think that is what makes it very clear. Like, we can be very crystal clear. Like, it's just like when you look at the census or any of these applications, and it's like white and then everything else, right? Like, they get to unite under one umbrella, but then we're trying constantly to divide ourselves into these different groups. And I think that that's the most clear perspective that I could put on it, in terms of how we can see that it is a counterintelligence operation. Like, it's very clear to me, because in terms of us speaking about achieving true liberation and knowing that that requires our unification, and that is the premise of Pan-Africanism, is to unite African people all over the world, regardless of where they were born or where they live or where they're from or where we're from. Right? That's the point. So even if you choose to make an identity distinction, that's very different from a political objective and outcome. And I think that the politics is what's being left out of the conversation. So once we bring the politics into it, to your point, but I honestly need to speak to Professor James Smalls and Baba Kaba Kamini personally to see how much they are aware of the politics. But I don't think that that's what I'm saying. To your point, I don't know how aware they are. That's a conversation that I would like to have with our elders. Now, regardless, though, I would say that Professor James Smalls and Baba Kaba Kamini are not elders, and for me, that I look to for political alignment at all. You know, and that's just the truth of the matter. There are elders, and there are people who have been consistent and clear and focused on the political reality. And unfortunately, during that period, right, where our elders were operating and doing the work, there was more of a compartmentalizing of the different struggles. The stage that we're in right now is really the holistic, right? We're bringing everything together. The cultural, the economic, the political is all converging now, because that's the space that we're in now because of the work that the elders did. But where the elders were, you had the people doing the political work, you had the people doing the spiritual work, you had the people doing the cultural artwork, you had the people, like, it was very divided in that sense. So we can look to the ancestors for what we can look to the elders for what we can look to the elders for. But I think we have to be just as critical of the elders and what happened in the previous years as we are of the ancestors and the previous movements that have happened. If we don't have a critical lens on it, what's the point? You know, we have to be critical. We have to be analytical in our thinking about how we move forward. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not inherently wrong. And I think that that's the issue, I imagine, with the elders, and particularly these two elders, in terms of them not criticizing the movement because of the social capital that's gained by aligning with certain individuals like a Tariq Nasheed or Umar Johnson or whoever it may be. And I'm not even trying to like put them in the same boat, but it's just the point that I feel like because they have a degree of social power, I think that a lot of the elders don't want to ruffle any feathers or rock the boat, and thus are not taking the responsibility of critiquing publicly, because who knows, like maybe there are some private conversations happening that aren't being made public, but there is no public discourse right now of what is wrong with and how this is politically disaligned with the objectives of what we need in order to liberate ourselves, which, as you said, we cannot align ourselves with the burning building. You know, we need to be removing ourselves from ground zero. And that's not to say that, and personally, I have an issue with the reparations being aligned with the FBA. I think that's a co-opting. Like, it's like they're definitely trying to do some type of like coup d'etat where it's like, we're leading the reparations movement. And that's absolutely not the case at all. So I want to completely separate that, because now that they're trying to like use that to be the political like wheelhouse of you know, this identity politics, which really wasn't rooted in any real political movement. It's like, now let's tie it to reparations because of how that emotionally appeals to people.
You know, yeah. Hold on, Neff, keep rocking for 1 second. I got my kids right outside my office door. I want to get them in order, right? Because I think that as a parent, you know, you got to put your kids in order at times. And I think that this is what the conversation is about today, right? The conversation is about the role of the elders in maintaining order or maintaining balance, or restoring order.
We don't need, like, we need the truth.
You know, when is running rampant. So let me just take a moment just as a parent.
Okay.
Right.
And while you're doing that, I'm just going to read some of the comments that are here. And I want to shout out everyone who's present with us right now. I'm just going to scroll up a bit to see. I see Araminta. There are plenty of Black people that don't identify as FBA, that don't associate with being African. How is FBA more divisive than other groups? This isn't a competition of what's more divisive or not. That becomes a distraction in itself. I don't even want to deal with the division at all, which is why, me personally, you're not going to catch me entertaining the conversation. The conversation we're having right now is, do Pan-African elders have a duty to hold them accountable, to hold this group, this identity politics? You know, like, I personally feel it's a distraction and a detraction from serious work that we need to be doing, which right now, to me, I'm going to root it on land and food. If people are not talking about land and food, it's very difficult to get me having that conversation with you, because realistically, with where we are right now, politically and economically, that's the conversation that we need to have. So anyone that's distracting us from that conversation, to me, is a problem.
Yeah. You raised a good point that I wanted to unpack just a little bit here, because there's so much, and I got time, so we can keep this conversation going. Like, we can let it flow. But you raised the point about, you know, you're not looking to all the elders for the same thing, right? Like, when it comes to political analysis, there are a handful of elders who I look to for political insight, right? And I think that this was demonstrated beautifully in 2008 at the great debate that was held in Harlem over Obama's presidency. If you look at that, panel of elders and organizers that was assembled, you had some giants that represent the African-centered tradition on that panel, right? You had, you know, Dr. Leonard Jeffries. I think you mentioned Dr. Leonard Jeffries, and you had Mama Marimba Ani. But if you looked at the difference in their arguments, it was very clear to me that politically, Dr. Leonard Jeffries on that panel was unclear. Whereas though Mama Marimba Ani on that panel, I think that her insight, her political insight, was so sharp and astute, and it started to show that there was, you know, there's a difference between kind of like, you know, the historians among us who did the great work of reclaiming Africa for African people, right? Who did the great work of helping us to remember, right, that African past, right? So they were engaged in this intellectual warfare with the Western Academy, who was seeking to rewrite history as an act of politics. So I appreciate those elders who were engaged in that work. And there's, you know, from the, you know, the Renoku Rashidis, the Professor Browders, the James Smalls is a part of that, like that tradition. But then you get your nationalists, Pan-Africanists, more, dare I say, I don't want to say activist oriented, but let's say nationalist oriented. And there's a lot of nuance to be unpacked here. So I feel like for me, when you get your Amos Wilsons, your Dr. Francis Cress Wilsons, your Marimba Anis, your John Henry Clarks, you know, there's a difference in the political critical analysis that they are offering and what they are pushing us towards. And anything, any formation that happens among Black people is either helping us to achieve our goals of liberation or it's taking us away from those goals. And foundational Black American, which is a splinter from the ADOS #lineage movement, from its very inception has been counter-revolutionary and has been an act of counterintelligence. If you look at some of the common arguments that are advanced by people within that space, I just wrote 4 of them down, right? The first one, Black people in America are not African and have no connection to Africa. We're Native Black Americans. I think that if Professor James Smalls and Kaba Kamini are aware of that, they have a responsibility to confront the ignorance that lies within that statement. They have a responsibility to confront and correct the misinformation that's in that statement. But that statement and that sentiment is replete within the FBA movement from the top all the way to the bottom. Second statement. Let me keep. I gotta give you 4 of them here, right? Second statement. Black people in America may be genetically African, but so is the entire planet. Everybody on Earth is African, right? This is more of this self-negation. Whereas though Dr. Clark, Dr. Amos Wilson, Francis Cress Welsing, Mama Marimba Ani, they were helping us to recover what it meant to be African politically, culturally. What are African values and sentiments that you need to empower African people across the globe? Hold on 1 second. Babe, come get her. Okay. All right, shut the door, please. I'm sorry. That's my 4-year-old, and I got the kids running around right now. But what are the aspects of our Africanity that are needed to empower us for liberation and to usher in and change the paradigm that exists on the planet, right? The paradigm of so-called racism, white supremacy, right? Francis Cress Welsing said we have a responsibility as African people to turn that on its head, to put the earth right side up, to usher in an African world order, an order of Ma'at. Only the parents on the planet can do that, right? And our ancestors have always known that we as Black people in America, there's never been an issue with us identifying as an ethnic group. We've always understood that just like other ethnic groups of African people, that we have a unique and common experience that bonds us together. We've had a way in which we've interfaced with the world politically and culturally. It's never, ever been a problem with us identifying as an ethnic group, right? But we recognize that as an ethnic group, we are an ethnic group of the African race, right? There's never been room for us to negate our Africanity because we understand that that connection is necessary in order to empower us to achieve our liberation goals, right? And there was 2 more points. The other one was African people on the continent don't refer to themselves as African, and Black Americans are the only people who practice Pan-Africanism. All misinformation, right? Because when we understand consciousness, there's levels to consciousness. You have ethnic consciousness, you have class consciousness, you have race consciousness. And from a race conscious perspective, we are members of the African race, right? So that race consciousness for Black people on the continent may not be as elevated as it is with Black people on America. That's because of the environmental conditions. If I'm around all Black people, the race consciousness is not going to be the thing that's heightened, right? The differences that might be revealed to me are the ethnic, consciousness, right? Or the class tensions that exist. But when you are a minority among a majority of white folks, that race consciousness is going to be heightened, right? And to argue that that African people don't have that is a lie. There's some who have it. there's some who don't. Just like here in the United States of America, there's some who have it and there's some who don't. But what we've seen with this FBA movement has been a concerted effort to misrepresent Africa and African identity based upon the worst of us. What they've done is they've taken the equivalent of saying, they're basically saying, like, it's the equivalent of saying somebody like Clarence Thomas represents Black Americans, right? They've gone out of their way to find the worst, the most divisive, and the most ignorant of our brothers and sisters who are abroad and not from, and don't have ancestry, or not, I almost say ancestry, so-called, who don't have so-called lineage here, to use them as the representation for why we're not African or why Pan-Africanism doesn't work. This has been a concerted effort to destroy one of our most significant political and resistance developments since we've been in the diaspora. And if our elders who say they're Pan-African are not speaking against that, I want to believe it's because they're not close to ground zero where all the ignorance lies, which is really on social media, right? So
yeah,
let me,
and they may not want to get dirty with that. Like, I'm just being real. That's what I'm saying. It's like there's a benefit to, you know, staying out of the, you know, just not getting so dirty, not getting in the mud with it. But like, there is accountability there, and like, you know, there has to be accountability there. That's what I'm saying. And I think that just dealing with FBA as an identity and not as a political stance is problematic. We have to look at the politics of this movement, the values of this movement. And to your point, just to echo that, it's the fact, it's not that you're saying we're foundational Black Americans, it's that you're saying we're not African, because we know it's both and. Right? Because I could respect that position as a strategy, knowing that I'm an African colonized in America. And now I can use this identity and the leadership and the positioning that it puts me on the world stage, because Africans colonized in America have a lot of power culturally. And when I look at the trifecta, right, the Merkut, the pyramid, I see culture at the top. Because ultimately our healing is really rooted at that point. It's a cultural healing, you know, and that's where the healing is. When we look at the politics and the economics, I see that as foundational, but I see the top really being the cultural movement that's happening. But ultimately being holistic about it, like Dr. Leonard Jeffries has the pyramid analysis. I love to organize everything, all my analysis based on that pyramid analysis. So we have an African-centered perspective that's holistic, that's merging the political, economic, and cultural reality. And when we look at that, we have to look at the fact that right now what's happening in the world is anything that's like kind of a national conversation, to be real with you, I feel is not sufficient, because we're in the era of globalization. And the way that moves are being made, they're being made globally. So there's an invested interest in keeping us from uniting on a global level. It's fine to have all the foundational Black Americans together and all the Black people in the UK together and all the Black people wherever they are, all the Africans. But it's not okay to have all those people come together. And that's what we have to look at. That was the point. That's the trajectory we're on. That's what the elders who have that political clarity, as you said, to the point, Mama Marimba Ani is one that I feel is very important, because she has the cultural clarity. And within that sense, right, when we look at the work that she's done and what she provided through her book, Yorugu, the African-Centered Critique of European Culture and Behavior, she talks about the both and how important it is for us to have a holistic worldview, an African worldview. And if we look at things, even with this ADO, this FBA situation and what they're doing politically, I do feel there's a benefit to it, because nothing happens for nothing. And I think we always have to take the higher ground. The benefit that I see to this situation is what it's exposing. It's exposing the level of ignorance, but it's also exposing a lot of pain. It's exposing a lot of fear. And it's exposing where our divisions lie and where we need to heal. that is to our benefit. That is an opportunity for us to now see where do we have this issue that we now need to heal and address, that's keeping us, that's preventing us from unifying. And now we can deal with that.
Yeah. No, and that's beautiful. Like, at the end of the day, like, that's the role of the teacher. That's the role of the educator, right? I did a lecture series back in 2020 called Strike Drum, The Political Awakening of African Consciousness. And the first three parts of that lecture, there's 10 lectures, but the first three lectures in that series are called, the first one is called The Ethnic Cleansing of Black America and the Black Immigrant Paradox. So what I do with that particular series is literally I help anyone who wants to understand the pain that people in Black America feel when they see our brothers and sisters from other places kind of like attacking us or talking down on us, right? I put things in a context so that we can understand one another, right? Our ignorance or our division is subsidized by our ignorance of our conditions, by our ignorance of our shared and common history, right? So if you're a teacher, if you're an educator, if you're an elder, you have a responsibility. When you see that pain, when you see that friction, you don't dismiss it. You use that as an opportunity to give context, right? Because what I heard Baba say, that history resolves the mystery, right? So if you give people that historical understanding, if you help us to become more historically literate, at the same time, you're helping us to become more politically literate. And it gives you a better understanding of why these responses that are represented by like FBA and ADOS represents a retardation of our progress, right? It represents a regression of where we've gone to politically. It has no association or connection whatsoever to our liberation trajectory, right? People can make the argument that, FBA is just another way of Black people in America identifying themselves ethnically. The problem with that statement is that it's a straw man. No Pan-Africanist has ever had a problem with Black people identifying themselves ethnically, right? It's always been understood that when we refer to African Americans, who we were referring to, right? People like to say, Elon Musk is an African American. No, he's not, because our understanding of African American, that particular denonym, it represents the Black people in the United States of America whose ancestors were enslaved, right, in the United States of America. Like, that's always been a clear understanding. So this new need to create an identity that's more specific, it's a politically flawed calculus. It's a calculus that one culturally has as its objective to remove our connection to Africa, right? That's the primary reason why you remove Africa from the identity. But the second thing is it has these flawed assumptions that by us correcting our status, right? It almost sounds like the Morris stuff. By us correcting our status or fixing our label, that we'll somehow be able to gain legislative repair, or these people won't be able to finesse us. And when you make arguments like that, it's
the same system. Like you said, it's counter-revolutionary.
Yeah, there's no relabeling yourself out of war, right? If you have this skin, I don't care what you label it as. You can label it as human. You can label it as FBA. It doesn't matter. You are in a war. And the only intelligent response to warfare is to actually study the strategy and tactics of your enemy. Study your historical wins and losses. When I do this, my enemy does that. So now I can outflank him and I can out-strategize him. But the issue is, this FBA movement is not a war-centric movement. Mm-hmm. It's a white flag movement. It's a way of saying, hey, I ain't African, because to be African.
I don't know who said this, but they was like, oh, they're playing like, they're not playing chess. They're definitely not playing chess. They might be playing checkers or Scrabble or something else, but they're not playing chess because it really is about strategy. I want to tap in because of what you're saying and how you said it. And like my train of thought already was on that because I was thinking about the quote from The Art of War. And it's like, know thy enemy and know thyself. If you know your enemy and you know yourself, you have no fear of the result of 100 battles. If you are ignorant of your enemy, but you know yourself, your chances of winning or losing are equal. But if you're ignorant of both your enemy and yourself, you are sure to be defeated in every battle. I feel that with the FBA situation politically, the way that it's moving, like you said, as a white flag movement, it's not revolutionary at all. It's like, how do we survive within the situation we're in a bit more comfortably? How do we get a little more comfortable in the situation where this domination continues on the planet and the status quo continues as such? It's not revolutionary at all. And that's because of the fact that it's not rooted in knowing yourself, knowing your own identity, nor knowing your enemy truly. And I feel like, because when we're using the word African, it's very key for people to really be aware that this is strategy. Because yes, we understand that race is a construct, but you have to be real. You have to be grounded and you have to be practical within the reality of warfare and the fact that you're dealing with an enemy. They give you the blueprint. You know, Charles Darwin's work, which they're still indoctrinating our children into in the public school system, The Origin of Species. I'm going to read the full title of that book so you know who your enemy is and you know what you're dealing with. We have a fear that we have to deal with. We're afraid of confronting the fact we're in a war. We're afraid of identifying an enemy. You know, that's why we want to wave the white flag. And we don't want to, because we know what confrontation looks like. But as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. Nothing's going to change until we take that position. Nothing will change. So the origin of species, let me just read this. The origin of species, by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. So like Dr. Frances Cress Welsing told us in the ISIS papers, it's about a fear of genetic annihilation. They're trying to survive, and that's in their nature to try to survive. That's in their nature. So within that construct of race, yes, you best take a position. You best take a position and know who you are in the construct that's been created that you're moving through anyway. You're going to your job or you're doing whatever you're doing within the structure. We're all using the money. Come on, like, let's be real. We're moving in it to the degree that we are, and we have to be realistic in terms of how we identify ourselves. Because for me, the true revolutionary, like a revolved perspective, right? Because it's not, we don't regurgitate the same thing. We have to spiral and expand. Identity-wise, I feel that the identity we need to be moving towards is one that unifies us. And that's not rooted in race, because race is their construct. But are we ready for that? We're moving towards that. That identity, in my opinion, is carbon. We are carbon compounded beings. We are carbon people. When they say that they want to reduce the carbon footprint, and you know who you are in that context, regardless of what landmass you're on or what name or vibration you use for that word, or it doesn't even matter at that point. I know I'm a carbon organic being on this planet, human, whatever you want to say, but the carbon, the chemistry of me, due to my African lineage, is a threat to some people on the planet that are controlling the means of production, controlling the economy, controlling the politics and the administration of the resources on this planet. You have to know that, you know, we have to be clear on that. And that's why I'm saying, like, all this other stuff is child's play. It's child's play. Like, we have to get clear. Like, it's getting serious right now. Like, food shortages are real. Food crisis is real. It's not a game.
Let me jump in, because I want to on the war conversation, on the war talk, because you brought up Sun Tzu, but there's another military general, historical military general, a Prussian general. His name is Karl von Clausewitz. He wrote the book. It's called On War, and he developed 9 principles of war. And one of those principles is this concept called an economy of force. I'm going to read the definition for y'all here, and I'm going to break it down to how it applies to just how you intelligently strategize during wartime. So I want to break this down for y'all. It says, an economy of force is the principle of employing all available combat power in the most effective way possible in an attempt to allocate a minimum of essential combat power to any secondary efforts. It is the judicious employment and distribution of forces towards the primary objective of any person's conflict. Right? Y'all got that? So let me break this down for y'all. In this war that we're in, what is our primary objective? Is reparations our primary objective, or is liberation or sovereignty our primary objective? And if our primary objective is that of liberation and or sovereignty, because that is the only thing that will ensure our survival on this planet, then what are the prerequisites or barriers that we have to overcome in order to achieve liberation and or sovereignty? Because at the end of the day, reparations is not given to a powerless people, right? So our primary forces, right? If our political energy is finite, then how do we deploy it in a way that ensures we are empowering ourselves so that when the reparations conversation happens, it's happening from a position of power? And I broke this down to the brother when he was on my live. I said that there's really only 2 ways to pursue reparations. You can pursue it legislatively, meaning moral based, because ultimately you have to persuade people in a multiracial society to support your claim for reparations. And the way that you get them to support is the same way you got them to support civil rights. You know, you march, you get dogs sicked on you, you show them the data, like, look what you did to me, you should feel bad, and because you feel bad, you should repair me. Or alternatively, at the end of a war, right, 2 parties sit down, the party that loses sues for peace, and as a result of that war, they have to pay reparations. But that being said, reparations is not our primary effort. How do you, it's backwards. It's putting the cart before the horse. Now, I'm okay with the secondary contingent of our people continuing to engage the fight for reparations, right? And you do that through organizations. Name one FBA organization, like, I'm not even going to go there. But you do that through organizations that are fighting on this secondary issue. You have a contingent that's focused on that effort. This is how you organize your body or your militia or your military intelligently. But the primary contingent, right, the bulk of your forces have to be focused on the main thing. And if the main thing is liberation, then how is that manifested? Liberation is manifested through a constellation of institutions, which means it's another word for a nation. Because a nation is nothing more than a constellation of institutions, right? It's a constellation of economic, military, political, cultural, and spiritual institutions that are created to house and protect the best interests of the group and ensure the group advances forward. So our energy should be going towards building those institutions that will house and ensure that that will house our freedom and ensure that we are a liberated people, right? That's the only way you get power, is through nationalism, right? Is through building those institutions of the nation. Without those institutions, you have no power. And without power, there's no path to reparations, right? So it's like the bulk of the FBA force, right? If we can even consider it an intelligent force, but the bulk of it is stuck on this reparations conversation, which is fine and dandy, but the conversation is so ill-informed.
Yeah, and it's so not building on the foundation of everyone else that's been doing that work.
It's so childlike. And in that regard, you know, those elders who are Pan-African elders have a responsibility to correct that, to point out those flaws. And I think that, you know, somebody mentioned, I think I mentioned earlier that, well, they may not be aware because they're not on Twitter, so they don't see people like Tariq Nasheed celebrating Africans being violently beat up in New York by African Americans. They don't see people like Tariq Nasheed putting a target on the back of black immigrants as people who are usurpers and thieves and enemies of black people. Like, they don't see that, maybe because they're not in the spaces.
I don't know if we can say that they don't see that. I don't know. To be honest with you,
well, let me go to the other side of that coin. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, because if they haven't been on Twitter, maybe they don't see it. But the reason why it starts to look bad and why some of our people are now calling the elders into question is because there's this conflict of interest in the relationship that undermines their eldership. And what do I mean by that? A lot of our elders, a lot of our teachers in the information age have developed a malignant dependency on some of the youth to help to get their messaging out. So what do I mean by that? During the 90s, right, you had all these master teachers that were teaching phenomenally, but they had no method of getting their teachings to the masses. So they become dependent on people who are excellent marketers, people who have excellent promotional skills that can build platforms. Then you get somebody like a Sinetta who can come in, right, and he becomes the vehicle through which the elders get their content to the masses. But then that pipeline becomes polluted, because Sinetta ultimately, his goal, he wants to spread the information, but he also wants to make money. So in that same pipeline, you'll get somebody like, you'll get a John Henry Clark lecture next to somebody talking about, UFOs, the planet Riz, and the Biru, right? And now the audience who's drinking from that pipeline doesn't have the ability to distinguish between Dr. John Henry Clark and, what's the dude who set up the Nawapians, right? And you get this same thing generation after generation. Now you got Tariq Nasheed, he creates the Hidden Colors franchise, and it creates a situation where those elders who are lecturers, some of them depend on their lecturing for their livelihood. Now they're in this relationship because this person has a platform, right? And this person has the ear of the youth. And that's the platform that I go through to get my word out. So it's like they're in this tricky space where now it seems like, oh, well, maybe you're not calling it out because you don't want to upset the relationship there, or you don't want to upset the connection there because you're dependent on that person's platform to get your message out to the community. So it becomes this trick bag where the platforms are excellent at promoting and the elders are not good at promoting, and they don't have the platforms. So now they have to depend on your Tariqs, on your Sinettas, on some of the Instagram platforms that exist in order to get in front of the next generation. And that creates this thing where it's like a parent that doesn't want to upset their children. I want to be friends with my child, so I'm not going to be critical of my child. I'm not going to do the job of disciplining them and correcting them, because they might, I might risk upsetting them. It's like the drug dealer back in the 80s who's paying for all the bills in the house. Mama knows you selling crack. Mama knows you out destroying the community, but mama also knows that you're paying for all of the bills in the house. So now mama is in this quagmire like, well, what do I do? Do I call him out for selling drugs, or do I just remain quiet because the bills are paid? And I think that that's the moment that a lot of people who are looking, they're now starting to look at some of the elders like, yo, do y'all not see what this movement is doing? Y'all wouldn't get behind an American Negro movement. And FBA is just an American Negro movement by another name. So now people are like, yo, what role do the elders have to play in correcting the ignorance and correcting the chaos? If the ignorance is hiding behind the elders, if the ignorance is saying shit, the elders support us, the elders align with us, right? So that gets into this other tricky bag that
it also shows us where the elders need healing as well, because it's like the desire for a platform, for attention, what struggle have the elders gone through prior to that as well? We've had a lot of elders that had to get, I went to Dr. Ben's funeral and it was under a white Jesus. You know what I mean? Like, he spent his final years in a nursing home. You know, it's like I definitely feel that there's an economic component to it, and I don't think that we've done well to create institutions to, you know, allow our elders to not be compromised in that way, you know. And I think, again, it's one of those things where I see a benefit and an opportunity of what is being exposed by this, you know. But at the same time, coming back to that point of the politics, you know, those aren't specific, like the elders in question that are being touted as like supporters of the FBA movement are not elders that I would turn to for political direction and political alignment. You know, they don't have political institutions that they've developed. And, you know, that's the fact of the matter. You know, can we even expect it? At the end of the day, I feel like everybody is on a unique individual journey, yes. But our goal is to look at the whole, like while we're each individuals, we're all making up a collective. And the reality is some people don't have that discernment. And if it's their lot to end up, because of their lack of discernment and their inability to be critical, and they align with that situation, like ultimately, like you said, it's a sinking ship. So if people choose to align with the sinking ship, like at the same time, there's got to be some casualties of war. And I feel like right now we should look at this situation as an opportunity to see where we need to strengthen the movement and what type of education is needed, what type of institutions are needed, because the FBA group can start developing institutions now too, but they could be institutions that are rooted in Eurocentric values, you know? So it's also like getting to the point where people really comprehend, like at a foundational level, at the core, at the heart, what's the point? And it does come back to the African center. And like I was saying before, the identity of being African is one that we have to adopt for political strategy. We also have to recognize the landmass of the continent of Africa being the most economically viable land on the planet. You know, there's a reason why they want to disconnect us from Africa.
And at the end of the day, acknowledging the fact that we are an African people and that our struggle is connected with that of African people around the planet, African people in Haiti, African people in Jamaica and Latin America, on the continent. Acknowledging that doesn't mean that we have to negate or forego organizing as the collective of Africans who are here in the United States of America, right? That distinct ethnic group, right, can still organize and build institutions to sustain itself and to advance its interests on these lands. It doesn't, in fact, that is needed, right? A strong group of African Americans is only to the benefit of the rest of the African world. Likewise, a strong group of Haitians or Jamaicans being organized with the right mindset, right? And that mindset is essential. The way that you see and understand the war is critical. And I think that if anything, that is the role of the elders that is missing in this entire FBA conversation. Because FBA at this point, I mean, I've never been called a tether. Like first of all, Black people, the word tether was the word that was exclusively used by white nationalists who were anti-immigrant up until 2019. After 2019, you saw a significant use in the word tether by Black people in America referring to Black immigrants. It's like, yo, how does this even enter into the lexicon? And how do we not see how do we not see the disconnection? Right? How do we get to a point where somebody who created a series to elevate people's understanding of their African identity, i.e. hidden colors, how do we get to the point where then that person turns around on the other side of the ADOS movement and is now pointing at Africans as our enemy and is purposefully and systematically now assaulting the framework of Pan-Africanism? How do we get there, and those elders associated with that person don't say, "Oh, you've gone off course. You've gone off track. What you're doing is ill-suited, it's uninformed, and dare I say, it's agent-like." I would start questioning, like, yo, what's going on here? Because what you're doing now is very COINTELPRO-esque, right? A lot of people gave excuse for, you know, the macking and the pimping and all that stuff, because people was like, well, you know, that was a part of this person's journey. But they've kind of like moved away from that, and they're now on this new journey. But now it looks like they've abandoned this new journey, and it starts to look real funny in the light. And because it looks funny in the light, and they're using proximity to certain elders to give them legitimacy, and those elders are not speaking out against the behavior, it's either because A, they don't know, or think that the problem isn't as big as it is. Because some people like to say, well, that's only on social media. Newsflash, Gen Z and the younger millennials, the way that they are informed and the way that they are engaging is through social media, which is why older millennials such as myself are even on social media. We didn't grow up in a social media era, right? I'm born in 1984, right? We had beepers, pagers, cell phone. We didn't grow up online. We're only online because that's the primary way of connecting with this next generation. And if somebody like me is telling you that this next generation is being misdirected, misguided, and pitted against other Africans for monetary gain, then you probably should want to listen to that. You understand what I'm saying? So I can say, okay, if you haven't been on Twitter, which has been the ground zero of this whole situation, then maybe somebody like Professor Smalls or Kaba Kamini doesn't really understand the magnitude of this anti-African campaign that has been waged under FBA. Maybe they don't understand the magnitude, but those of us in this generation who do understand the magnitude of it, we can look, right? We can look and say, hold on one second. The Radical Geek said that's cap. Oh, y'all was using AIM. I wasn't using AIM, brother. I was in the streets when people was using AIM. I'm damn near 40 years old, so I'm just saying I look young, but nah, I wasn't. I graduated high school in 2001. I think Instant Messenger was probably like the late 2000s or 2010s. So yeah, I wasn't using AIM. You know, I think I look young, but I'm not young. All right. So you threw me off there with that message when you said that's cap. But anyway. The point that I'm trying to make is that it starts to make those of us who see what's happening under this banner of FBA and under this banner of ADOS and the elders that are getting close to it and being used as legitimacy, we start to question, are you not criticizing because you have an economic dependency or relationship with, you know, you're dependent on staying connected to this particular movement for your own monetary benefit? And if that's the case, then it makes you like, I don't really like it.
I mean, it is a question of power. Like, really, truly. You know, if this person's in a position of that much influence, has that much of a platform, that much of a voice, that's power. And, you know, is it in your best interest to, you know, criticize this person who has this power? You know, it does create a power dynamic that we have to acknowledge. Like, it's an obvious one, I think. But in terms of how we can make our elders accountable, I think that that's a different conversation. I think they do have the duty. We've answered that question. But how do we lift them to be accountable to that duty, to actually critique what is going on, and to actually be accountable for knowing all of the different, you know, I guess the lanes that are now, like,
I think
spreading from this FBA identity.
I think a big part of that is that the elders have to be able to hold each other accountable. And so many of our warrior elders have removed themselves from the public discourse and kind of like withdrew and are a bit more reclusive, you know? So it's like they might eat, like, because I mentioned like the 2008 Great Debate. I feel like that was almost the start of like seeing the political divide within the African-centered movement, right? Because I look at somebody like a Greg Carr, for an example, right? Like when I was younger, I didn't have the ability to distinguish politically kind of like the camps within the African-centered movement. I didn't have that eyesight. But the more and more big events that occurred, and you started to see some of like Greg Carr is he's erudite when it comes to our history and the timeline and breaking it down. Like he's wonderful, well-read, well-studied, a beautiful, ingenious Black African mind. But when it comes to our politics, right, over this last decade, I'm like, whoa, like it started to scare me. It started to realize like, oh, we got a whole camp of Democrats and dashikis in our community. Right. I'm not saying that to be disparaging. It just really started to highlight to me, like, since the age of Obama. And I think that debate with Mama Marimba Ani, the great Harlem debate, it started to show the divergence that exists politically under the African-centered camp. And it went all the way up until, to 2020. You had African-centered elders out here talking about, if y'all don't vote, then y'all enemies of the people. And I'm like, wow, like how do we get here? So in that regard, those of us who have a very, very clear lens politically and culturally, there aren't too many elders that we're looking to for political guidance and for political direction, because we're realizing that a lot of the elders are not clear politically, right? So that's another part of the conversation. But the tough part is those elders who are clear politically, they've kind of like removed
and I don't
themselves
blame them.
from the public
I don't blame them, because I don't even be wanting to get online. But at the same time, I don't really necessarily feel it's their responsibility. I look at Mama Marimba Ani. I feel like that is my spiritual mother. And I don't want, like, if I have to take the bullets and come forward, right, as an extension of creating what we're creating, building the institutions we're building based on that foundation. She wrote the work. She did the work. She's still alive and present. Do we really want her to get in the mud? No, like, I'm fine with her not getting in the mud, but that's a responsibility that puts on us to now bring that message forward and, put that clean glass of water and that political, cultural, and economic clarity forward. And I think that that's what we're doing. And I want to acknowledge that, because really some of these elders are not going to come to the forefront, but we can lift them in the work that we do, because it's not about the intellectual masturbation and just regurgitating information. It's now like, okay, you read the work, you read your Rugu, okay, you're healing, okay, now what do we build with that? Because we have to build, we have to create those institutions.
Let's lift up some of the work that we are doing, because a big part of our collaboration is rooted in work, right? So of course, we got the African War College, which is an institution that is coming together for a very specific collaboration with Tahuti Ma'at, which is another institution. And together we have formed what's known as the Amos Wilson Collective. So now if you want to take a moment to lift up some of the work that we're doing there.
That's the Amos Wilson Collective, also known as the ARC, the African Rehabilitation Center, is not only a virtual space, but it's really a connecting point where we can connect and create community, build community virtually, be able to exchange resources. We have different programs that we're doing. Like tomorrow, we have our Intuit Healing Cipher, which we do once a month. And the Intuit Healing Cipher tomorrow is going to be focused on processing emotions in the digital age. We're recognizing a lot of work that's happening specifically, I feel, around Black men becoming more emotionally aware, and the healing that we need to have between both men and women, and the dynamics that are happening in terms of balancing how we show up as women in our masculinity and our femininity, and men in their masculinity and their femininity, how we're engaging with one another, because we know the foundational institution is really the family. So the way we build strong families is by coming together as strong individuals. So the healing work that we need to do is very, very essential. So tomorrow's Healing Cipher is one of the programs we're offering through the ARC. We also have a war talk that's scheduled on Sunday. So I don't know if you want to talk about a bit of what we're going to discuss in the war talk that we have, but there's also 2 war talks every month. And on the in the ARC, it's a Discord server. So there's different chat channels where there's different resources on there. You have different archives of lectures. We're also just sharing and spreading different resources. So there's an array of different things. Every month, Tehuti Ma'at puts out a Moonly report, which really deals with the energy dynamics in terms of the energy that we're moving through, really rooting in our African spiritual traditions. So there's a lot of different things, but like the emphasis on the war doesn't mean we, abandon all the other, aspects of things. I think the spiritual rooting is really essential to us coming into our full cosmic awareness that we've had ancestrally. So yes, we acknowledge we're in a state of war, but also the whole point is for us to liberate our spirits. So we have like a really true balanced approach within the ARC, where we're dealing with a lot of like really active masculine elements of the work, but also some of the more passive and receptive feminine elements of the work that we need to do.
Yeah, the ARC is holistic. We're bringing together the masculine and the feminine. Where, we talked about in previous generations how things were so compartmentalized, where you had the economics, the spiritual, the political, and they weren't necessarily talking to each other. So the goal with the ARC is to really have a synthesis of all of the above, which serves as the foundation for what we're trying to build. So although this is a virtual community and it serves as a virtual connecting point, the goal is to build actual material in the real world communities that's going to be reflected by institutions, right? So we have projects in the real world and programs in the real world, but ultimately, like, people say, hey, why don't you just point the folks who are lost to different like organizations and tell them to get involved in the work? I think that there's a level even before you go and get yourself involved in an organization, because if you show up how you are, all you're going to do is bring chaos, right? This next war talk that we're doing, myself and Neff, we're breaking down over this past 60 years how we've devolved politically, culturally, spiritually, as a collective, right? What have been some of the attacks that have put us to this point where right now and today we're culturally illiterate, we're historically illiterate, we're politically illiterate. And if we don't address that literacy gap, we're not in a position to build, certainly not building based upon values, right, that are conducive to our longevity and to our wellness, because Eurocentric values will never be conducive to building an African world order, right? So if we're trying to create that, it's important that we put in place a process by which our people can be re-educated and or rehabilitated, right? The African Rehabilitation Center, also known as the ARC. So everybody that we're bringing on, we're referring to them as our ARC builders, because what are we trying to do? We're trying to collectively build transformational power for the purpose of transforming our material conditions, our spiritual conditions. But it's key that folks understand that that transformation starts with you, the individual. There's parts of you that you have to heal, and only you can do that work. We can't do that work for you, but what we can provide for you is a community of builders, a community of healers, a community of warriors that's working in a collective and moving in the same direction based upon the best of our intelligence, based upon the best of the analyses that have been developed by previous generations and passed down to this current generation. And now we are adapting what they gave to us, and we are innovating and trying to find new ways to disseminate the information where we don't have to be reliant upon people who are not congruent with, you know, where we are going, because they have a huge platform, or because they have influence right in front of the people. It puts you in a situation where it's like, okay, I got to depend on them. And it's like, no, we don't. We already have the blueprint for how to build strong institutions and strong movements. Now, in this current reality, the work is much more difficult just because of the fragmentation of the African mind, but the mandate is still the same. The mandate is to remember and repair that African mind. So those internal reparations, they start first, because you can't be repaired. You can't seek repair externally. You can't go to your enemy and demand the reparations that are owed to you without strength. You have to have the ability to exact punishment and reward. Right? These are acts of power, and we don't get power without developing that necessary group ideology, that group cohesion, that group oneness. And all of that is understanding, that all of that is rooted in our understanding of who we are and who we've always been as African people. So that's what the Amos Wilson Collective is all about. If you'd like to join, there are 2 entry points. You could, the Tahuti Ma'at is an entry point. So on their Instagram page, you can hit the link to join Tahuti Ma'at. And based upon whatever level you join at, you'll get access to the Arc of the Amos Wilson Collective. And on my page, if you go to my link tree, right in my bio on my page, if you hit my link tree, there's a link that says African War College, enroll today. If you enroll in the African War College at one of the various levels, you'll get access to the ARC, or the Amos Wilson Collective, based upon the tier that you enroll at. But we are encouraging family to come on board the ARC, come on board and join our leadership, AKA our ship of leaders. Come on board and join our warriorship, AKA our ship of warriors, and assist us with the building, assist us with the heavy lifting, because many hands.
And I wanted to speak on what you were saying about the oneness, because there's a bit of conversation happening in the chat around, and I want to get your perspective on this, because to me, whether someone chooses to identify as what they are or not, I see Pan-Africanism as a universal, you know, connection point of all African people. So just because there are people who are choosing not to identify with that, I don't necessarily see that as being that they're separate from the Pan-African world. But I'm curious what your perspective is on it, because I did see a comment from Araminta 1820 that was saying, you know, that the elders do not need to be, do not have the duty to hold any non-Pan-Africanists accountable for the business of Pan-African work, which I don't think we want them to be held accountable for the business of Pan-African work. We want them to be held accountable because these elders are being aligned with them, especially in the digital space with the promotional work and the rallies and the things that are happening. You know, once you align with something, yes, you then, I feel you do have to be accountable to what you're aligning yourself with. You know, anytime you choose to have your image or your likeness involved in anything, you then become subject to, and you're connected to that thing. And I feel like as elders, there's a higher level of responsibility. And that's what we're talking about. It's like, what responsibility do they have? Because they have aligned themselves with this particular ideology and the political ramifications of that ideology.
Yeah, it becomes a tacit endorsement. And like I said, the reason why I wanted to lay out the fact that FBA, the sentiments expressed within the movement are first and foremost anti-African. I think that we have to acknowledge we have to point out and identify the anti-African sentiments that exist within the movement. And that relates to not only just our identity as African people being against that, but the level of hostility and some of the toxic engagement that we now are seeing, like towards African people from other shores, so to speak, right? So we have to acknowledge that. But then the concerted and systematic assault on Pan-Africanism as a framework, right? If you go to Tariq Nasheed's page on Twitter and you just type in the word Africanism, you'll see thousands of tweets. I'm exaggerating, but you'll see lots of tweets of him. He'll show something of like a coon in Africa, and he'd be like, so much for that, like Pan-Africanism. Like, so over and over and over of using instances that are emotionally laden, right, that have emotional baggage, to paint that as the representation of Pan-Africanism. And he should know better, right? You don't point out the ignorant as a representation of Pan-Africanism. That's not what you do. As a teacher or as an educator, if you see the ignorant, you give context to their ignorance so that you can bridge the divisions, right? You don't further the divide. And that's what this entire movement has been doing. So the point that we raised in terms of, do our Pan-African elders have a duty to hold them responsible? The reason why we raised it in that way is because the two elders we're referring to in particular have embraced that movement. And by embracing it, you also have a responsibility to correct it, to inform it, and to
it's not about denouncing it, because I see that question on there. Do you want the elders to denounce FBA? No. Holding them accountable would be if there are political attacks being made on the rest of the African world, that's not foundational Black American, then that's something that needs to be spoken on. That's something that needs to be addressed. And any of those attacks or anything that's like, we're not African, it's like, can we acknowledge both at the same time? It's like, if someone's a Christian, does your Christianity override your African culture? Does that override your African spirituality? There's a difference in terms of how people engage. It's not inherently wrong to say that you are a foundational Black American. As I said, that can be a political strategy as well, but that's not the way that it's being wielded at this point. And then I also saw a comment about how we have to relearn our nature and the fact that we've been stripped of our unique tribes and still
I saw that. It's from Sister Ethio Flower. It says, we also have to identify that we are also African tribal people, and that we have been stripped of our unique tribes that are still programmed in our DNA. The way that I would speak to that is, so there's a diasporic context to African identity, and there's a continental context to African identity. So within the diaspora, we as African people are an amalgamation of different African tribes. In fact, I think one of the examples that I used when I was having the discussion with the brother is, within the United States of America, there's always been formations that have developed that have sought to identify us as a unique ethnic group. For an example, the New African identity. The New African identity, if you listen to Baba Imari Obadeli, what he says is, New African represents a group of African people who are, one, an amalgamation of the different African tribes that were enslaved here in America, but we're also, we have a connection because we have some native ancestry, right? So there were some melanated people who were already here, but then there were also some Native Americans that look like the so-called red Native Americans that we have as a part of our ethnic amalgamation. And then, due to the crime of enslavement, some of us have some European ancestry. I think that in the diaspora, I think that 25%, I think that the majority of people in the United States of America have at least like 25% European DNA. So when we start talking about like tribal identity, you have to recognize that because of this experience of the Ma'afa, African people in the diaspora have created a new group. A new group has been formed that never existed before, and it's the amalgamation of all of these various tribes. And that can coexist with the historical ethnic and tribal identities that have existed throughout the past. So, the Wolof, the Yoruba, like those, they can all coexist together because we're still all racially African people, but there's no problem with us aligning and having an appreciation for our specific ethnic experience and history.
Yeah, and I
That's
think
never
that
been
there's
a
a
problem,
unifying
right?
element to that in terms of awakening our genetic memory. To her point about like what is dormant in our DNA, a lot of people are already awakening to that reality. But I think it's also the fact that ancestrally our perspective, our identity was beyond this planet. Like when you look at Kemetic sacred science, when you look and how that has continued and how that still exists in Mali to this day, for example, with the Dogon traditions, we had a cosmic view of ourselves. We knew that we were cosmic beings. And I think that that part is really difficult for a lot of people to deal with, just the practical reality, but really the unifying element again is to rise above the division and the distinctions. And I don't feel that the collective is truly embracing that yet, but it's the shift that's happening. And there's a lot of us who are here to lead the way. And that's another thing I want to say about the Ark and Tehuti Ma'at in general. Tehuti Ma'at is designed for warriors. You're a spiritual warrior, you're a leader. Because to be a leader means you are ahead. You know, we're paving the way. We're building the ark. We're building the path for our people to be able to come in and rehabilitate, you know, to be able to have that capacity to go there and to explore what's in our DNA. And right now that's very critical because you have a lot of these spiritual, like this new age shit is really getting messy as well, where you have a lot of people getting caught up in the whole, like, you know, aliens and, or just like a very ungrounded, unpolitically sound, very, you know, split
Escapism.
Identity in regards to spirituality that we really have to deal with as well. To join the Ark, from Tehuti Ma'at, our Kingdom rank is $22 contribution, $22 a month donation to the institution to be a part of Tehuti Ma'at. And then there's the $44 rank, which gives you access to Tehuti Ma'at Academy. You get access to our workshops and classes for free. In addition to all the things that you get with the Kingdom rank, which you get the Moonly Report, which has the energy readings. You get access to any exclusive gatherings that we have. You get access to the Ark, which is the Discord server. And you also get to participate, as I said, in any of the real world gatherings we have. Right now, our main base is in Brooklyn, New York. So that's where gatherings and things happen in the physical reality. But the virtual space is very active, and we have the virtual programs that we mentioned. And then there's also the $88 a month contribution. That's the highest rank, the Galaxy rank, and that's if you actually want to contribute to the cooperatives. I did see a question that someone had put in there about 5-year plan and objectives. If you go to tehutimaat.org/about, you can actually read our ideology, what's the 11-pillar platform for Tehuti Ma'at, as well as our leadership training and the fact that Tehuti Ma'at is actually built to develop cooperative institutions. So there are cooperative business ventures that people who are participants in the cooperative who are at the highest rank, which is the Galaxy rank, are able to contribute to. So that means you could be a part of the High Tops and Heels, which is a creative communications agency. If you are an artist, a graphic designer, a web designer, whatever services that you offer, you can align with opportunities to do that work through that space. You can also share your content and your art through hightopsandheels.com as well. That's an option. And then we also have Tehuti Ma'at Academy, which I mentioned. If you are a member at the Galaxy rank, you can actually share your courses and your classes and things that you do through our online educational platform, and we'll actually work together to co-create and record and get all of your content up for that. And then we also have Coins and Karis, which is a healing marketplace, which is all handmade or just like artisanal healing or spiritual tools and services that you can offer through that space as a vendor if you're a member of the cooperative. So, yeah.
Yeah. And for the African War College, we have 5 tiers that you can join at. It starts at 11 and it goes all the way up to 111, depending on the level you want to tap in. But we have the supporter tier at 11. We have the Asafo tier at 22, graduate tier at 44, and the builder tier at 88, and then the sustainer at 111. These are all monthly. Of course, you can pay for the entire year. And the breakdown of what you get depending on the tier level is just hit the link in my description, the link that says enroll in the African War College, and there's a breakdown. Yeah, so 22, 44, 88, 11, or 111 are the 5 tiers for the African War College that you can kind of like tap in at. It's unapologetic that every endeavor that we do is also an economic endeavor. Like, we are really, really working to figure out like how to advance us economically and monetarily at the same time as we're doing the work politically, because you cannot, and that's why I've been lifting up a lot of the remarks from folks like Amos Wilson, folks like Dr. John Henry Clark, because we've been trapped in this money phobia bag, is what Dr. Amos Wilson calls it. We've been trapped in it over the past century, and at the end of the day, nationhood can't be advanced or developed based on the donation model. Institutions can't be advanced or developed based upon the donation model. So we have to, in fact, Dr. John Henry Clark, he called specifically for a commercial revolution, because we have to master the modern techniques of economics, because that's a significant part of the warfare. So I personally am unapologetic about the fact that we need to, I'm not going to say support economically, we need to patronize economically, right? So your membership represents a part of that commercial exchange, but reciprocity is significant. So there's value in the exchange. There's value in the relationship. Based upon the tier that you join at, you get to access the value that the cooperative has to offer based upon what you value or what you desire to give, right? But at the end of the day, it's an exchange that's ultimately rooted in Ma'at, and we're trying to encourage more of that, because that economic reciprocity needs to occur so that we can build an ecosystem that can finance our programs, our projects, our institutions, because without that, we're going to be locked in this maladaptive state of dependence, where then our character gets called into question, whereas because we're dependent on certain individuals, right? Because we're dependent on certain platforms, then we have to be quiet and not criticize them because we're dependent on them economically. So we got to be able to break free from that. And that only happens from us understanding and participating in our own economic
seeing the value of the work that's being done. Speaking of Ma'at, do you mind answering this question? Have either of you spoken to Dr. Ma'at in regards to your question? Because I know you told me that you actually got to speak to Dr. Ma'at.
Yeah. So I reached out to Dr. Ma'at yesterday just to let her know that we weren't putting her in the crosshairs with this particular conversation, because that's another name that people in the FBA movement like to throw out. You know what I mean? Like, oh, well, what about Dr. Ma'at? Like, she like supports like FBA and things of that nature. That wasn't the conversation that I wanted to have. The question was, what is the role of our elders? You know, and much love and respect to Dr. Ma'at. Dr. Ma'at is my peer. She's my sister. I support her. I support what she has going on. And I know that she has her own relationship with the brother Tariq Nasheed. She's been in a number of his documentaries, I believe. So I think that that's something that she'll kind of like have to wrestle with on her own. But at the end of the day, all of us who are Pan-Africanists have a responsibility, right, to confront misinformation and miseducation wherever we see it, right? Bob Baruti said that our mandate is very simple. He said that our mandate is to teach the ignorant and ignore stupidity, right? So the elements of this movement, the FBA movement that we're calling out, the elements that are blatantly anti-African, the anti-African sentiments that exist within the movement, the anti-Pan-African sentiments that exist within the movement, the misinformation and disinformation that FBA represents, all of us have a responsibility to call it out. And when, like, if folks like Tariq Nasheed, to call them by name, if they're out of order, if they're serving as agents of chaos and disruption, regardless of your relationship with that person, you should feel that you have a responsibility to call that person.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an attack.
And I'll
I feel like it's just, yeah, I feel like people want to constantly make that dynamic out of it, but it's just about like addressing the issue. I think it's just that, addressing the issue as an opportunity. Because I don't see anything as a problem, really. I see it as an opportunity. And I really feel like this person said, getting a good tax preparer, bookkeeper, and tax professional in general. Yes, I would actually really like to hire. That's one of the things in the budget milestones is we need to get membership so that we can pay for, right now things are in a deficit, in terms of the expenses to run all of the virtual platforms. And then in addition to that, we have a physical space. We have land in Brooklyn, in Weeksville, which is a historically one of the first Black Wall Streets, like one of the first sovereign Black communities post enslavement, in the divided states, Weeksville, in Brooklyn, in the heart of Brooklyn. And that's where our land is, and maintaining that land and doing that work in our program, Organic Food for the People, that initiative to create a truly sovereign food network, it needs to be funded. And in order for us to hire bookkeepers, in order for us to pay for the websites and pay for the different softwares and the things that we have to use to maintain everything, like those are expenses. And on top of that, people are not being compensated. Yeah. And I do feel that revolutionaries need to be compensated as well, so that we don't get compromised, so we can get paid to do the work that we need to do. But the people, the community has to value that work. And I feel like that's the shift that needs to happen now. So, yeah, I think that that's very important. And I appreciate,
that's why
the exchange.
Yeah, that's why a big part of what I'm trying to do right now is really give a re-education. And then, at the end of the day, these are all mandates that were given to us. When Dr. John Henry Clark calls for a commercial revolution, it's a responsibility that the next generation has to pick up and carry forward. When Dr. Amos Wilson says that we have to confront our money phobia and our economic trauma because business and money have to be a part of the work that we're doing, like, it's our responsibility to take this on. And I think that we have to confront anybody and anything that gets in the way of this. This is why I've been so, my disposition towards some of our, Black Marxist brothers and sisters has been, my posture has changed towards them, because I see them as in the way, right? I see them as agents of misinformation. I see them as actors of foreign powers. From a nationalist perspective, you understand what I'm saying? Okay,
that could be a part of our conversation we have on Sundays, War Talk, because that's part of what has happened in the space and time. I think a lot of people are not aware what revolutionary politics is, because for me, like, I wanted to reference, because in question of Dr. Ma'at, I haven't talked to Dr. Ma'at in regards to this question, but we did do a great panel, Think Beyond Black, which is on the High Tops and Heels YouTube channel. It's also on hightopsandheels.com. But that panel that we did, Dr. Ma'at was on that panel, and it was a panel with Black educators. It was really phenomenal. But I don't know what Dr. Ma'at's revolutionary, I don't know what her politics are, like, to be completely honest with you. So I cannot speak on anything in regards to that. So I think that that's one of the things I want to begin to clarify, because the purpose of Tehuti Ma'at is a revolutionary ideology. It's a political position, but it's not merely political. It's also spiritual and economic as well. So yeah, it's holistic. So yeah, I think that we've pretty much answered the question.
All right, all right. And at the end of the day, the floor is open, to engage, with Baba James Smalls, Professor Kaba Kamini. Like, let's have the conversation. Like, let's have the dialogue. You know what I mean? Because what we're not trying to do is add to the fragmentation, and we're not going to allow the ignorant among us to divide us. You understand what I'm saying? So you're not going to allow the ignorant among us to divide us from Dr. Ma'ad or divide us from Professor James Smalls. Like, this is nothing but a conversation
Yeah.
for to have as a collective in order to bring clarity to the discussion. You understand what I'm saying? Because at the end of the day, the points that I'm raising regarding the behavior of FBA from its inception as a splinter group from the ADOS movement are unassailable. Right from its very beginning, it's been anti-African. From its very beginning, it's launched these assaults on Pan-Africanism, right? And these are conversations that, like people are trying to hide behind the fact that, like, they'll say, well, FBA is a lineage. So within the lineage, you have people who believe all types of stuff. And what they're hiding behind the fact of is, no, FBA is a specific group that comes out of the hashtag lineage movement. Because the lineage that FBA claims, right, not all of the people in that group, such as myself, align themselves with this FBA contingency that comes out in 2019. Prior to 2019, you never heard a Black person in the United States of America referring to themselves as an FBA, right? So the nature of this thing being a movement is something that you cannot escape from. You cannot escape from the politics of the movement either, right? So once you come under that flag, and I know that the leader of that movement likes to give himself plausible deniability and say, well, this ain't no movement and I ain't no leader. The code is the leader. It's a lot of ignorance. It's a lot of chaos.
Yeah, I feel like I don't know enough about like what's going on, and I haven't really tapped into that world. So for me, I don't speak too much on that. I will say that, Professor James Smalls has welcomed us into his home. When we were recording the interview that he did for the Happy film, and Baba Kaba has been one where, we studied with him in his Dogon cosmology course, and he really influenced and supported the work that we were aligning for Sankofa, our youth program, pre-colonial African history program, in that early stage of development in terms of how to connect with the children and educate children specifically around orienting them into time. And, I have great value for these elders. I'm just being honest about, in terms of their political positioning, they're not elders I would turn to for any political orientation. So I think we should engage them in this conversation for sure.
I have a great deal of respect for Professor James Small's political analysis and his political calculus. In fact, he back in, I think, July, you just brought up Happy, Brother Taki and Sister Felicia organized a discussion with Professor James Smalls, Kaba Kamini, and the young brother Chase. I think his name is like the Voice of the Ancestors on Instagram is his name. And initially I was invited. Taki invited me, but then he disinvited me, and I don't know
invited
what that was
you to
about.
What?
I feel like he invited
for what, the Happy event that they just had.
It was a discussion about the divide between FBA and Pan-Africanism, and he had Professor James Smalls, Kaba Kamini, and the young brother Chase. And Chase is kind of like, he's like he's like a younger Tariq, meaning like he has a platform where he puts out information from the elders, but I don't think that he doesn't add any particular political insight like of his own. I mean, it's more of a platform where he shares information across a wide array of Black voices. But I don't think that he has the clarity to distinguish even the ideological differences between those voices. I think that takes a you know, a little bit more development. But I think he's a young brother that is trying to do good work. And I know that, you know, Hoppy, Taki and them have like embraced him, and they support him. So he was one of the, he was the FBA representative on that particular discussion. And initially, brother Taki reached out to me to join it, but then he disinvited me. So I'm not sure if he did that because he thought it would be like confrontational to have it there. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, even on that particular panel, the first thing that Baba Kaba Kameni did was lift up John Henry Clark, right? First thing Kaba Kameni did was say, as John Henry Clark states, Pan-Africanism or perish, right? So that was one of the first words that came out of his mouth. And then Professor James Smalls, he stated that, you know, there's no contradiction. He said, for the past 20 or 30 years, I've been always saying that we as Black people in the United States represent a unique, you know, ethnic group. However, we are an ethnic group of the African race. Like, we've always been like African people. So that's why I'm saying that I really don't feel like they're familiar with a lot of like the arguments that you see happening on Twitter.
Like those arguments are not like, I'm not saying they're not a problem, but I just feel like we do acknowledge it's both and. Like, at the end of the day, like that doesn't, FBA does not eliminate Pan-Africanism. It doesn't eliminate the truth of the fact that we're all over the world, you know, and that we are coming together. It doesn't eliminate that. I feel that engaging in that, because not everybody who's aligned with FBA, which I feel like if there's a flag, there's a movement. Like, that's disingenuous to say this is not a movement or this is not political. Because I also see a comment on here right now that says Pan-Africanism is political and FBA is supposedly not political. Because everything is political. Everything is political. And we cannot deny that. Yeah. And our definition of politics also has to be clear, because politics is not just voting and government. Politics is the administration of resources. And those resources can include ideology, ideas, intellectual property. It can, and I think there's a whole financial component to, you know, wielding this identity or this group. You know, like, people are funding things, people are truly invested in a very real monetary way as well. So it is political. It's highly political.
Yeah. I mean, to say that it's not a group, again, is disingenuous. All you have to do is just look at the behavior and practices of the people who are under that particular banner, who come under that flag. Just search the hashtag non-FBA, search the hashtag tether, right? I mean, the brother Sincere, I had him onto my page, and the first thing he asked me, he started gangbanging. You know, who your people, like, where your people from? These are all reflections of the behavior and the psychology that comes down from the leadership of that group, right? The brother said you can't, a lineage can't be an identity, or a lineage can't be a movement. Well, a lineage also can't be trademarked. And we know that the person who created the term FBA also tried to trademark it, right, as a brand by which to do business. Yeah, I think we
should be honest about that. If you're okay with all that, it's okay. Like, I think everybody should be critical. I'm critical of Pan-African leaders. I'm critical of all people who put themselves in that position to influence my mind and my ideas and my thoughts. I think everyone should absolutely be critical and honest, more importantly.
Yeah. Sister Armena 1820, she says, I also think that people are able to discern when popular content creators stray away from the work of our elders and ancestors. I would actually, I don't think so. Because what happens is you have a generation of people who had no connection. Well, like, so there's one thing to be able to identify the historical personalities, right? You can identify Malcolm. You can identify Huey. Happy birthday to the ancestor, Huey P. Newton. Today is his birthday. You can identify Huey. You can identify, you know, Kwame Nkrumah, Kwame Ture. It's one thing to identify the personalities, right? And under a broad sense, you'll say these people were all fighting for Black people. There's another thing to be able to go a level deeper and identify their ideology and the progressions and changes and contortions in their ideological development. So you'll get a situation where people will put on a banner a bunch of like black faces, and it's like, yo, ideologically, Dr. Amos Wilson, Dr. Francis Press Wilson, Dr. John Henry Clark, they would never align with something like this, right? But it's like, because our people don't know that, you can get a situation where, okay, they've been introduced to these personalities via a documentary series, and now the person that introduced that series to them has aligned himself with those scholars that gives him an air of legitimacy. So now when that person moves or deviates, you start to believe, oh, well, he's just correcting where they went wrong. You know, and you'll hear FBA people say that. They'll say, you know, what's wrong with learning more and then correcting, you know, where the ancestors went wrong? Essentially, the ancestors went wrong with the Pan-Africanism or their African identity. So a lot of the young generation don't have the insight to be able to differentiate, or to use a word they love, to delineate the ideological lineage of the different thinkers within Black America. They don't have, because you have to read their works to get that, and a lot of them don't even read.
But the thing is, the truth of the matter is, like, yes, you're right. First of all, majority of people are not able to discern, but the only reason why they're not able to discern is I feel like there hasn't been enough on the other side. Like, there was an argument being made that Pan-Africanism was dead, because I feel a lot of Pan-Africanism was underground. It was very grassroots, you know, like, even for me, like, personally, I haven't been on creating a platform for myself. I've been doing the work. And when you're doing the work, you really don't get accolades and the attention that a lot of these other people get. And right now is a moment where I feel like the way that we address that in order to support creating the discernment is put more clean water out there, is put the ideology out there. Because to me, it's not a threat at all, because it's like, it's something that doesn't really have a leg to stand on. Like, it doesn't have a firm ideology, you know. But when you provide people with ideological clarity, you provide people with vision, and you provide people with direction and structure, that's very different. And I think that that's where we're at right now in terms of driving the work forward, what we're doing with the ARC and the institutions that are already established, you know, and the ones that will continue to come together and be built from the work that we're doing. So it's really not, I just don't see it as that big of a problem. I do feel like the elders do need to be engaged, though. So I feel like we just got to put more clean water on the table.
Close this out. The brother Sincere says, I've been to plenty of Pan-African events, and I couldn't help but notice the absence of Africans from the continent. I saw you say that on your live stream, but I'll tell you what, y'all understanding of Pan-Africanism has been so bastardized. I'm not saying this in a disrespectful way. I'm saying it because the introduction to Pan-Africanism that most of the FBA space has occurred within the context of an anti-Pan-Africanism movement, right? Before Yvette Carnell put out her presentation in November of 2018 that Pan-Africanism is dead, most of the people in that space had never even heard of Pan-Africanism. So when you say you've been to plenty of Pan-African, another thing that's often said, people will say, I used to be a Pan-Africanist. And whenever they say that to me, right, I say Pan-Africanism has meaning. So what organizations were you a part of, a member of, that was working towards advancing a Pan-African agenda? And right away, they'll say they won't be able to name anything. So when they say they used to be a Pan-Africanist, they mean like an idea only. So when the brother says he's been to plenty of Pan-African events, what Pan-African organizations put on these so-called events, right? You have to realize that over the period of the 1990s, even the concept of RBG, right? Ideologically, we've gotten so politically distorted and confused over the last 60 years that we really do not have the ability to discern, right? But when you say you go to these so-called events and there are no Africans there, I'll give you a perfect example. We created an organization, or I was a member of an organization, Afrocentricity International, right? The Philadelphia chapter, the founding leadership had an African from Kenya, an African from Haiti, an African from two Africans from the United States of America, an African from Nigeria, and I don't want to miss anybody. We had Kenya, Haiti, Jamaica, 2 from the United States of America, and 1 from Nigeria. So Pan-Africanism, especially here in the diaspora, right? Pan-Africanism has always been something from its very inception that has included Africans far beyond just those who are here in the United States of America. But again,
there's a lot of factors to that though as well. Like I just feel like when you're really rooted and you're doing your work, like first of all, it's very expensive to travel. Like I've been based in Africa, and to travel to come to some Pan-African events is not like I don't know. I just feel like, yeah, maybe there aren't that many, but like that doesn't change the fact of, the fact of the matter. Like it is going to be expensive for to travel to Africa or from Africa. First of all, that's that's a major part of the dynamic that's been created, and why it creates a huge degree of separation, because it's not easy to travel to and from Africa. It's very expensive, and I'm saying that firsthand. But yeah, but despite that, I feel like there was also a question of like, it means that grassroots Pan-Africanists haven't put in work in the community, so that young people lack in the information, so that young people don't lack in the information needed. And I think that that's not necessarily the case, because I feel like on the grassroots notes, in terms of the work that we've done over the past like 8 years, like if you're teaching young people how to grow food, that's a very practical, hands-on thing. You're having real world impact on people's lives and their spirit, the way that they view the world, the way that they're able to express themselves. That's not necessarily, you can transmit information in that case. You can transmit skills, but that doesn't give them a political history and foreground to really comprehend how to navigate how their identity impacts them in the overall, political landscape. I don't think that's a whole different thing.
I want to be able to save this.
Okay.
And my
All
phone
right.
is about
so
to
let's
die,
wrap
so I don't want to
up.
lose
I think it was a great conversation. Thank you to everyone who was present with us.
Yeah. And since shout out to Brother Sincere, me and him got a one-on-one coming up. We're going to keep our conversation going. So shout out to that FBA brother, because he identifies as FBA. But what I will say, he said that there aren't a lot of Africans or continental Africans that show up to Pan-African events. Here's a fact for you. There aren't a lot of African Americans that show up to Pan-African events, because historically Pan-Africanism has represented our resistance, and the majority of African Americans have always been integrationists, like in their thought and in their political, especially post 1964. At some point during our history, some of us were more nationalist oriented, but a lot of us are not actors of resistance, and not a lot of us are not actors of revolution. In fact, if you go back and read,
a lot of our revolutionaries are still locked up.
Exactly. So I just want to raise that point that, like, when it comes to our resistance and it comes to our revolution, the large majority of African Americans are not even a part of that fight. A lot of them are just trying to be American, and they want comfort here on this particular plantation. So that argument is not necessarily it's not a strong one, so to speak. But I want to close out. Neff, I appreciate you. I saw Dima Mahmoud, my sis.
Asante Sana.
Shout out to
Hatepa
Dima
Ma'at. And power to the people.
Yeah, peace, y'all.